Good afternoon. My name is Scott Redler, Chief Strategic Officer at T3Live.com. Welcome to the first trading day of 2016. So I guess we walked in and there was a little bit of a surprise. You had China down 7%. You had Europe down 4%. We had a big gap lower. I don't think, as far as the way we were set up into the new year, most people would have gone out very long, considering, we closed on the lows of the day on New Year's Day. A lot of sectors below the 200-day or below some of the key moving averages, especially the momentum ones. And but even being long a little, you probably got a little pushed around because in the first 10 minutes they flushed them and then pretty much did nothing the rest of the day and then closed off lows, making some guys who were thinking we can get a weak close into another gap down tomorrow. They probably have to wonder what are they going to do, what they have to do into the close on that push, and then people waiting for better prices, considering it felt as if we were heavy all day, had to be like, oh, was that it? So let me just show you what I'm talking about. If you go to the chart of the spiders, you will see that here was the close of the year. Let's take a little close up. The spiders actually closed pretty much below the 200-day, below all the moving averages. So some guys probably went out short, even thinking, oh, if they put new money to work, maybe I'll short more, because basically you have this little series of lower highs, low high, lower high, lower high, lower high, lower high. But then, so 2 down days into this. So the question is, was this enough? And if you look here now, I'll be honest, I'd be if I was short, I'd be a little uneasy, considering look at the size of the volume, okay, and look at the size of this gap. So we are extended from the moving averages. So if the market wants to, it could probably gap up, and people who are short will say, okay, you know what? If it's gapped up, I'll short a little bit more here into 202.47 and see how much of this gap stays open. Okay, because midday it looked as if it was going to be a huge hole in the chart. So now I guess in the next few sessions, if they fill it, it's more back to this monotonous mess. I know for me, midday I was kind of hoping that we would close weak and get a little bit better prices. What do I mean by better prices? I was kind of thinking in my head that this gap down here gets tested, which is all the way down towards 196.33, or at least tries to fill it. So in my head, I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to wait. This is the first day of the year. China was down 7%, et cetera, et cetera. And then, look what happened in the last, 5 minutes of the day. It's hard, hard to see that coming. It basically, if you take a look like this and just kind of see, when I put the volume in here, it kind of skews. Here was your first move on the 5-minute basis, where created this bear type flag and then made new lows, came back up, couldn't get back above, came back down. I guess you could say this was a bit of a higher low, not by much, versus this area. And then there is a term, you never short an igniting bar, and I won't say like this is such an igniting bar, but you had a 2-bar move that engulfed this lower range. That could have been, if you were heavy short, your little clue to cover some. And then basically the move that a lot of us were looking for right here, happened after a shakeout into the close. Okay, and it did close a little bit above 201. Right now I think the data is a little slow. So again, you go back to some of these charts now, and at this point, not saying the bulls have control, because they don't, but they took a little bit of the ball back, for tomorrow to see if some of the gap gets filled. You look at the Qs, same type of thing. In my in my morning note, I talked about huge support in the Qs, and it right here it pushed a little bit below and then closed on the highs and has this huge gap. Question is, how much of it does it want to fill? At this point, if you bought into support, here was that big zone, so closed strong. Maybe it fills this. Maybe it was a false sense of security, and who knows? That's why it's hard. China was down 7%. Maybe it goes down another 3 or 4, but if it reclaims 3.5 of it, the future's going to be up 15, and you have to figure out whether or not you could hold short, or if we were down 3-4%, whether you want to be involved in another volatile day to the downside, when again we just started the year. You never know what's going to happen. So for me, I went out flattish versus going out short or long, and I'm going to just let the first few days pan out a little bit. The Russell really didn't have much of a rally off the lows. It's been very weak. You look overall, the Russell itself, it's already almost back towards the August lows. So this at this point is considered one of the weakest sectors. A little bit of a ascending channel here, broke to the downside, kind of like what happened here, below all the moving averages. Can it fill a little bit of the gap after 3 down days? Maybe. Almost like the same thing I talk about, on the buy side. Usually, if you come to me, you try and buy day 1, you add day 2, sell day 3. So if you did that from the short side last week, you had 1 down day, you could have added on New Year's Day, and then you covered into day 3, not trying to get a day 4, day 5. Doesn't mean a day 4, day 5 can't happen, but day 4, day 5s happen a little bit fewer and far between. As far as what happened with some stocks today, Amazon broke the 50-day and was a lot weaker than some of the other FANG names. We'll see if that continues. It did come into this little area after breaking the 50-day. I guess we'll see if it goes sideways a little bit and how much of this it reclaims. And if it doesn't reclaim much of it, chances are it might be able to continue lower, maybe to a more compelling spot a little bit down here. Okay, but at this point, you had this breakout type failure, which it broke above resistance, gave you a trade last week, closed back below it, so at least it gave you some clues to get out of the way. And after 3 down days, we'll see what happens versus this little pivot here. This pivot here is 627. Google acted a little bit better. Same kind of thing though. You had this breakout failure where it gave you a nice little 2-day trade above the prior high, and then came back in. Whenever that happens, you do not stay long. This was a nice little pivot buy right there, went above it, and then once it came back below it, that was your trailing stop. So now at this point, is Google done? I don't think so. But again, you didn't have to be in through that mess. And this actually came back a little bit further. We talked about the 50-day and then talked about this support area. Didn't quite make it down to here. And at this point, came off the lows a little bit better than some other names. So we'll see if it bounces back to resistance, which is now curling down and heads lower. But at this point, it's a bit of a noisier trade. Not nice and tight. We like it when it's nice and tight. That was this into that. Now it's just like, okay, maybe you could buy versus lows, and tomorrow, if it opens down, maybe you could buy to push into the gap, which is what tomorrow will be. So depending on tomorrow's open tomorrow's up open or down open, that's pretty much what my strategy is going to be. It's going to be today's close and then the gap that's open. So just say the futures were down, 5 handles or so. I would say, I would write down the support and say this is yesterday's high. If you could trade into that above pivot or that high pivot, there's a big gap to be filled, and maybe you make some cash flow. If it can't fill a big portion of the gap, the sellers have more control. Okay, whatever. That was Amazon and Google. So now you go to Facebook. Facebook came a little bit off the lows, but also lost momentum. This stock actually was weaker than Google and Amazon going into the end of the year. It actually broke this little spot right there, below the 50-day now. Gave you a bit of a rally versus the old highs here. Okay, so symmetrically it held kind of where it had to, and now it could fill this gap and push a little bit. So like tomorrow, if Facebook was down 25 cents or 30 cents, I'd say look to see if Facebook can go green, and if it could push above 102.24, chances are you might be able to get a cash flow trade back to maybe this spot, which would be a little closer to 103.66, etc. And that's how you would set up your day trade. Okay, if it happened to open up, I would say see if Facebook could stay above yesterday's high of 102.24ish and work its way to fill some of the gap, and then we'll see what's next. Is we're gonna have to draw a bigger range. It's no longer tight. So when you get a range expansion like this, the trade kind of changes. So you have to be a bit more careful. Buying too early, or even on a big move lower like it was. Shorting. I think some guys that pressed today in the last hour. Either covered into the close or went out short and are worried, okay, what happens if we gap up? We got to deal with that tomorrow. Okay, but anyway. Netflix had a little bit of a move. Nothing great off the lows, but, a little bit of a bottom tail. So it was weaker last week. So if you went out short and you were thinking it would break below this key support, which it did, it now came in and gave you a little bit of a bottom tail. What does a bottom tail mean? It means that sellers, met buyers, and buyers at the end of the day took a little bit of control back. And that's what basically this did here. It doesn't mean it's going back to new highs and getting above this spot, but from 130 down to here, it reclaimed this moving average, and who knows this. Everything has this gap now. So the question is, who will fill that gap or who won't? If they fill the gap, it relieves some pressure. If they can't fill a big portion of the gap, that means people aren't thinking this is on sale, and typically it moves lower from there. But for today, you had some volume, you had a bottom tail. Maybe there's a day and a half trade here. And you'll see. Apple actually tried to go green, you know, and was kind of strong for itself. It's still a broken name. People are like, why do you think Apple is strong? I'm like, you know what? I don't know. Maybe the buyback button was on. Maybe new mutual fund monies have to buy it because it's one of the most widely held stocks out there. I'm like, this was your time to sell it. You know, here some guys shorted it, and now it had a reversal on some volume. So does that relieve some pressure? You know, it probably does a little bit. Does it mean you could just buy it whenever? Probably not. This is where resistance comes back in, and that probably comes in now closer to, what's the spot here, like 106.75. So big bottom tail, some volume. Maybe that put a short-term bottom. Look how far all the moving averages are above. So if you were short from here or short from there today, gave you a little bit of a clue to cover, and then we'll see what kind of open we have tomorrow. If Apple opened lower tomorrow, like futures are down and it was down 50 cents, I'd say Apple gave some rare relative strength yesterday. See if it can go green, and if it could trade above 105.37, chances are you might be able to get a little bit of a push to, you know, 106, 107 for cash flow, but I wouldn't, you know, go press into tier 3 on it. So that's basically it. You know, today, very volatile day. You could have made a quick money short, you know, in the first 10 minutes as it pushed through some pivots. You know, some guys actually shorted a bounce at 2 o'clock but got ran over into the close. I don't think a lot of guys were, you know, trying to run in front of someone else to try and buy this down open, thinking we can get some more downside. Why wouldn't we? You know, it was only the first day of the year. No one seems like they're going to be in a rush. They're going to be a wait and see. But then that end of the day move created some bottom tails to see how much of today's gap we fill tomorrow. So I am babbling a little bit, but it's been a long day. Hopefully your day wasn't as long as mine, and you'll be in a position to, you know, excel tomorrow. So with that being said, I'll see you at the morning call. Have a great night. Happy first day of 2016.